Well, let's, again, this is intriguing to me, and I want to come back to organizations also. But going to the micro foundations question, but then you made the interesting distinction between the macro topics like state and revolution and state formation, and you described it as the meso level,
right.
Organizations, social movements, and so forth. And
Right.
again, I find that an interesting distinction. Your definition of, or how would you describe that distinction between the macro and the meso?
Right. There is a field in sociology that says all this distinction between meso and macro is reification, and everything is small group. Is network, communicative based. But that's true at one level. But the range of effects and the way you aggregate lead one to even there, focus. Yes, there are Browdelian movements that end up being just aggregation, of individual in time, space, and then the institution is like a froth for the. If you really took the Browdelian perspective very seriously, I think you would see monarchies. That's just that's a cultural or societal froth on the grand movements of the longue durée.
Where it's really just a sum of people's demographic behavior and their economic and their market.
That sense of it. And I think for middle range, for anything less than the grandest level of change, institutions and the shape of institutions will be where a lot of the action is, and where almost all of the connection of sociology to social policy, for instance, is. It's a little bit at the micro, very little at the macro, because you usually think you can't affect those macro very much, and most of all of it's at a meso kind of level or something. So.
And just to have a little bit of an inventory of the meso kind of things you're thinking of organizations, social movements,
institutional analysis,
institutions,
right, and
universities as a category, I suppose.
As a category, education and socialization, and how it differentiates and changes with society. It's not as if the education is a static institution. It does have historical dimension. So does the family, and the forms of these are up for grab across civilizations and cultures.
So the variation across instances is itself a very important subject.
Yes,
is what you're saying.
Yes, and in too many of the fields of sociology, which are sociology for 90% of sociology, if you take the two or three major journals, and if you look at the distribution of what research is done, if you take the 25 odd sections of the ASA, there may be 3 or 4 sections that have a serious historical component. So even though I've always agreed with Chuck Tilley that all behavior is historical, and that doesn't shape the way sociologists think and act, which is much more contemporaneously focused. And I would, I because I bought the Tilley bug, I call it, getting caught by history. I push everyone who I work with or have worked with in the last 20 years to think about the historical dimensions of their work, even if they are doing a basically contemporaneous study, so that they don't assume that the scope conditions of their theories are bound by the objects that they have to recognize the extent to which the scope conditions are bound by the limited time frame that they are studying, and that's also a limited comparative frame, and therefore not universalizing their empirical findings from the state of American contemporary research on America to the world. So I strongly believe in that.
Which also folds into a point I think the historical sociologists argue, which is about the contingency and the path dependency of almost every subject,
Right.
institutions,
Right.
outcomes, processes,
Right.
which again I think Chuck Tilley is also
Sure.
emphasizing.
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit about the other subject, or one other subject I'm interested in, which is the nature of social knowledge. So far we've talked a little bit about how you as a sociologist have thought about the subject matter
Right.
and the object of study. What is it that you think sociologists ought to be getting to as a form of social knowledge? Is it a set of high-level generalizations? Is it some very particular descriptions of this organization and that organization? What is the nature of the knowledge you think that sociology ought to achieve?
Well, the problem, sociology is a diverse field. It's doesn't have a singular paradigm or agreement on singular methodology, so it's hard to, one could try and dictate but to the field, but it's not going to buy. So you realistically have to, I think, since I've written on sociology as a low consensus discipline, low consensus on methodology, low consensus on core concepts, there may be actually more agreement on core concepts than we think, just because we tried this experiment once in the department here of a couple of people trying to look across all the different topics that we talked, and you would end up seeing some core things coming up quite often: conflict, consensus, division of labor, differentiation. So you could get a list, not too long lists of concepts that everybody talked about, sometimes in different ways, in different subdisciplines. But since almost all of the research is done in quasi-bounded fields, except for a few people who really think about general systems, whether they go back to the old notion of general systems or to the Nicholas Luhmann kinds of things. Those folks talk about more universal processes and shape their own propositions that way, but it's not, if you then go and look at the way, take a dozen journals across the range of sociology, the levels of discourse and the levels of generalization and the relationship to those generalizations to the inference levels are very disparate. And so I end up with, the propositions and level of knowledge have to be, they're set by the architecture of the subdiscipline. And I love the term architecture of disciplines, although I'm not exactly sure I know what it means. But it is, what's the level of generalization about the Civil War? How does that relate to civil wars in general, or does it? The historians have a level of proposition development in their interpretive models. I'm talking about not comparativists. I'm talking about standard line historians. And they make propositions and they try to get lessons from it about the development of American politics. But they don't attach those back to general theories of politics very often, and so that it becomes much narrower